Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you and welcome to Broadway Buzz and welcome to Back to the Future. In 1985, when this movie opened, it generated $384 million. 2 sequels would follow, and it would generate a total of over $1 billion. It's the largest science fiction franchise ever. And the story behind it is an amazing story of rejection. Keep in mind, when the young men who wrote this script passed it around Hollywood, they started in 1980. It was rejected 40 times. So obviously, you know, aside from having talent and brilliance and determination and discipline, you have to have tenacity and you have to have luck. Okay, so let's start with that for a minute. Let me introduce those 2 young men. Bob Zemeckis, who would go on to be one of our great filmmakers. You can read his bio in the program, but he gave us works like Forrest Gump, Castaway, Murder Becomes Her, Polar Express, I mean, on and on and on. And he always has experimented with the idea of moving film forward with special effects. Bob Zemeckis was born in Chicago in a very blue-collar family. He told his parents at a very young age that he was going to become a famous movie director, and his father said, "Son, you can make so much more money being a truck driver." And happily, he didn't listen to his father. In any case, he would go on to the University of Southern California, where he would meet Bob Gale, who was another young man who was determined to have a life in filmmaking. Keep in mind, the University of Southern California in this period was focusing very much on a very esoteric view of film, and they dealt with, you know, the French New Wave movement, et cetera, and all of the students were very heady and very into all of the European methods and techniques. And these 2 young guys said, all we want to do is learn how to make movies. And so they did. And Steven Spielberg was one of their teachers. And so every day they would follow him out to his car saying, here are some more samples of clips we've done. And Steven Spielberg was so delighted with their tenacity that he took a sort of special interest to them. Very early on in the 1980s, they would write Back to the Future. And Back to the Future is a time machine story. Now keep in mind, the time machine, where it can either send you back in time or ahead in time, is really an ancient idea. And you know, most mythology has examples of it. The Greek mythology has it, the African mythology has it, and we've seen examples of it in storytelling, you know, in fairy tales and going back, you know, centuries. But also, you know, it would find its way in many other forms. In novels, for example, H.G. Wells would write the great novel, The Time Machine, where he would literally define the device that could transport you into the future or into the past. And it still stands as one of the great memorable science fiction books. Was turned into a movie, incidentally, that was very well received. But then again, we have to remember, it found its way, this notion of time travel has found its way into our popular culture, certainly. I mean, think of Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol, going to Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future, or think of, you know, other works, Mark Twain's wonderful story, A Connecticut Yankee in the Court of King Arthur, where a contemporary Yankee goes back in time. So it's a story that has always beguiled us. You know, we think of the past as things being frozen and fixed. Certain events happen in the past and they're fixed. But in most of the mythology that we read, and in this movie that we saw, and in the musical we're about to see, the past is mutable. It can change. The premise of the story, you see, it's about a young boy, Marty McFly. He lives in Southern California. The time is 1985. He comes from a very difficult family. His father is a Casper milk toast. His mother drinks. His two siblings have no ambition at all. And the only way he can ever see a kind of bright future is by having an association with a mad scientist, Doc Brown. And it then becomes a story of coming of age. It's a story about family dysfunction. It's a story about a young boy having dreams. He wants to be the next Mick Jagger, and music is his way out of this sort of dark pit that his family is living in. And he's very enamored of Doc Martin, who is this mad scientist. And you remember, in movies, we had that whole body of films with Jerry Lewis, or on television, we had Milton Berle, and they were doing all these stories about mad scientists, et cetera. So this is a story that embraces so many things. It's also a very simple and lovely love story. So what happens is they write this work, and in the process, they pass it around, and as I told you, everyone rejects it. And mostly what everyone said was, you've got to decide what the movie is going to be about. This is about too many things: a coming-of-age story, a love story, a back-to-the-future story, a mad scientist story. Too much, too much. But of course, this is what made it so delightful, and this is what made it so universal. And in a way, when you go back and look at that movie now, you realize that the movie is really satirizing movies of the day and satirizing all of these various genres and forms, and they make fun of it in the most delightful way. So in any case, how the movie would come into being has a great deal to do with luck. The two men were about to consider becoming truck drivers, I must tell you, when all of a sudden Bob Zemeckis was offered a directing job because of Steven Spielberg, and it was a film no one was interested in, and it was turned down again by everyone. It was called Romancing the Stone, which of course became a great hit. So suddenly Bob Zemeckis, who went from being nobody in Hollywood to suddenly being a somebody, and these very same studios that turned down his work suddenly said, "Oh, young man, we're very interested in knowing what you're working on right now." And so when he started passing around Back to the Future, everyone sort of changed their mind. And then finally, it would be Steven Spielberg who would help them get a major production of the movie. And of course, the rest is history. They would go on in their careers to do very monumental and very experimental work. You can read both their bios in the program. One of the things I really love to point to is that Bob Zemeckis has recently gone back to the University of Southern California, where he has endowed it with a huge sum of money so that they can develop experimental filmmaking and all of the things that made his films so interesting. Remember, he did that wonderful film, Who Killed Roger Rabbit, where you mixed animation with real actors, or in Polar Express, they filmed it with actors playing the role, but then they would animate the actors. All these very interesting new wave techniques that would be used so brilliantly in our popular cinema. So they have certainly made their mark. Now, how then did the musical get made? A very interesting story. Keep in mind, Bob Gale has always been the keeper of the flame of Back to the Future. I mean, keep in mind, there are constant revivals where they show the whole trilogy of films at film festivals, and Bob Gale goes and speaks, or they do the anniversary of the movie. It has one of the largest cult followings for a film in the world. And when people go to see the movie, they dress like the characters. They can recite every line in the movie, et cetera. Every great line that Doc has, the entire audience shouts at the screen. So, it's really a kind of happening. So in any case, Bob Gale was at a DeLorean convention. Let me pause and remind you that when they were working on this project, at first they couldn't decide what the time machine was going to be. And at one point, they even considered that it could be a refrigerator. But then they thought, no, this is really a terrible idea. Every young kid in America is going to try and lock himself in a refrigerator, and the movie would be sued by everyone. So in any case, in that period, in the early 1980s, the DeLorean car came out. And as many of you remember, it was a very experimental car. It was very sleek. It was very sensuous looking. It was very 21st century. The doors didn't open out, they opened up. And so it was a spectacular visual. It was a car that was produced in Ireland, but it never really took off. It never really had a great success. They had production problems with it. The car would break down. So it never really became literally the car of the future. But because they featured it as their star, as their time machine in the movie, it would become immortalized, of course. Okay, so he's speaking, Bob Gale is speaking at a DeLorean convention in 2006. And there's press there, of course, and because everyone remembered that it was the movie that made the car so famous. And in any case, when Bob Gale was speaking, just sort of out of nowhere, it popped out of his head. They said, well, what are you working on right now? And he said, oh, I'm working on a musical version of Back to the Future. Well, this just came out. And at the same time, Bob Zemeckis was in New York with his wife, and they had just seen the producer. And when they walked out of the theater, Bob's wife said to him, why have you never turned Back to the Future into a musical? So both of them sort of had this moment of epiphany at the same time. And they, this is all the woo-woo that's in Back to the Future, so you understand where it comes from, these two men. And in any case, the next day, they both quickly call one another and say, you can't believe what just happened to me. And they both tell one another the story that they thought that their movie should be turned into a musical. They had already decided that the franchise was over. I mean, when they did the 3 films, they were so beloved that they were very frightened of ever doing a 4th sequel to it. They didn't want to disappoint the fan base. The fan base would have destroyed them if they'd done something that wasn't appropriate for the characters or the adventures of Back to the Future. So in any case, they both have this idea of doing a musical. They say, let's meet in New York and let's interview some major Broadway producers to see what they think. Now, let me just pause and remind you, Broadway producers have never been very open to Hollywood. I mean, even though a large number of our musicals are made from movies, it's in New York that likes to initiate the idea. Keep in mind, when Disney moved to New York and they announced that they were going to present musicals, the Broadway theater went crazy and the critics were awful and they wrote terrible things about Disney. And then, of course, Disney gave us a whole series of extraordinary hits, including The Lion King, including Aladdin, including Little Mermaid, all of these things that would transform our musical theater and revitalize it, bringing families to the theater and huge sums of money that would literally play all over the world. So in any case, these two men, remember, they have made $1 billion. Not too many people have done that. So when they meet with the producers are very condescending, and they say, well, what makes you think this could be a musical, and who is going to be your composer? What Broadway composer is interested? And they said, well, we haven't gotten that far yet. And the producers all said, well, when you get your act together, let us know. And they were very dismissive. And so the two men looked at one another and they said, we're going to have to do this ourselves. And so what they did, again, this is the tenacity they have. What they did is they thought about people they had worked with who had created scores for them. And of course, they'd have countless numbers of films to their credit now. So they decided on Alan Silvestri. And Alan Silvestri was a composer who wrote the music for Back to the Future. If you remember the movie, the score was very opulent. I mean, it was like hearing Star Wars. It was when the movie started and you heard the swell of the overture, I mean, you had goosebumps, and it was 100 instruments playing this very elevated, adventure-like music that really set the mood for Back to the Future. So they dealt with Alan Silvestri, and he said, yes, I'd really love to do that. There's a lot of underscoring that we used in the movie that we could use in the musical. Remember, underscoring with music is in every movie, and it's a very important ingredient. So much of the elevated energy and excitement and sense of drama and tension happens from the music, the underscoring. We don't use music that way in the Broadway musical. So, I mean, we have underscoring under some words leading into a song, which we call recitative, but we don't really have underscoring in that way. So anyway, Alan Silvestri said, I'm very interested in working on this project. I have no history of working in the musical theater. I have written a lot of songs that have been nominated for Academy Awards, but I've not written for the stage. And so they say, okay, who can we find to write the lyrics? And this is when everything changes. They all think at the same time of Glenn Ballard. And Glenn Ballard is a lyricist who worked with all three of these men on the Polar Express. And he's a very clever, literate writer who has a wonderful sense of language, who is whimsical and funny and satiric. So all of these qualities seem perfect for the project. And when they started talking to Glenn Ballard, he revealed, of course, that he had worked on a musical that was very successful both in London and in New York, and that was the musical Ghost. Let me just pause and remind you, Ghost was first of all a movie. It was a story, a sort of surreal story about someone dying who's sort of caught between life and death and sort of appears as a spirit in the story. In the movie, it required all kinds of phenomenal special effects to make that happen in the movie, and they were very successful in putting a team together for the musical where they could create all those magical effects that worked in the film, but worked even better on the stage. So Glenn was a perfect person to join this group, the first person in the group to really have the experience of working on a musical. And he suggested Colin Ingram as producer. And this was the perfect choice. Colin Ingram is British. He was the producer of Ghost. So again, he was familiar with taking a movie, transferring it to the stage, taking a movie that had a phenomenal number of special effects that made it so cinematic, and he found a way of making that work in the musical and moving the story forward. The show would be a big success in London, and it transferred to New York. So the team now is in place. They hire a British director. And again, they do a series of workshops in New York and in London. They announced that in 2015, the show is going to open in London. It's the 30th anniversary of the movie of Back to the Future, and they'll get an enormous amount from the fan base of excitement and energy in supporting the work. So everything is in place when everything falls apart. The director they hired decided that the antagonist in this story is a young boy named Biff. And Biff is the high school bully. And we see him, misbehaving so terribly as a bully. We all grew up, every high school, it's required that there's a bully in the school. We all have our bully story. And in this case, this bully is central to the story that we see. In any case, the director said, in a very peculiar way, the antagonist can't sing any songs. And they went, what? Did you not read Phantom of the Opera? Did you not see the musical? I mean, the antagonist always has the greatest musical numbers in a musical. And he said, no, he can't sing. So anyway, they came to a parting of ways, and quite simply, he was fired. So in any case, they had to cancel the opening. And again, this is tenacity. These original artists believed so strongly in their project, they were really willing to abort the whole thing. And so they had to wait 5 more years to re-put the show together. They hired an American director named John Rando. He was famous for directing Urinetown. Urinetown, needless to say, you can tell by the title, was a very offbeat musical, but it would win the Tony Award, and he would win a Tony Award for Best Direction. What made John Rando so perfect for this project is that he was a team player. And in a musical like this, the real star of this musical is the car, the time machine. They would spend over $1 million developing what they would do with this time machine. They would build models. They would have as many workshops for the car as they did for the whole production. And they decided the car had to be built on a turntable. It had to be built on an hydraulic lift. It had to be able to turn sideways. The wheels had to move. They say it goes 88 miles an hour on stage. That's no easy feat. And so they have these long workshops where they put huge amounts of money into lighting, special effects, sound. Sound plays a very important part in creating the reality of the car, and then blending that into a set. So therefore, you really do need a director who's very visionary, who understands that he can spend as much time with the actors and the telling of the story and the choreography as he does with the car, because the car is the star. Okay, so everything goes together. The time now is 2020. The show opens in Manchester, England. There's a very large opera house there that has huge backstage space, so it's perfect for a show like this. Also, Ghost had previewed there. It's a very accepting audience and a discriminating audience. So it was a wonderful choice to open the show there. Gets rave reviews, and 3 days later it closes because of COVID, which is a story now we've heard several times with the musicals we're seeing now. So they stop dead for over a year. Finally, this COVID epidemic breaks a little bit, and they decide they're going to be one of the first shows to open in London. I just want to pause and remind you about something. It is such a big deal that the theaters closed in London, more so than anywhere else in the world. Because remember, during the First World War, during the Second World War, even when London was being bombed, the theaters played every night. They never closed the theaters. The only time the theaters ever closed in London was in 1667. Now, who else would know this but me, right? I spent my life being a nerd. But in any case, in 1667, the bubonic plague happened, and Shakespeare was about to open his new tragedy in the Globe Theater, and of course, it couldn't open, it closed. So that's the only time the English theater has been closed. Even during the Spanish flu that beset the world, New York theaters closed, but the London theaters never did. Okay, so in any case, we're now in 2021. They're ready to open the show. They have very little time to do it. There's no time to take it back out on the road to redevelop it. They just take the cast they had, and they very quickly open the show. On opening night, the actor who plays Doc, which is a central role, a major character role, one of the centerpieces of the show, came down with COVID and could not perform. And the understudy, who was a seasoned old veteran from, the West End Theater, had never been rehearsed in the show. He had watched the rehearsals, but he had never been taught the dances or never worked with a vocal coach, or he had just been there watching, taking it all in, and suddenly he had to go on stage opening night in front of an international audience of critics and play the show, which he did with great distinction. Everyone was thrilled. 2 days later, he came down with COVID. And so then they had to go down in the list of the standby for the standby, the swing as he's called, and luckily, again, he had studied the show enough to go on. So, you know, through tenacity, these men have survived everything. When the show ultimately played in London, it would win the Olivier Award as Best Musical. It has a tremendous following in England, and it's a huge success. Okay, it then transfers to New York, where it's wonderfully received also, and is currently playing in New York. It was nominated for a couple of Tony Awards this couple of nights ago, but was bypassed by other shows that have come in that are showier and newer and you know, more pleasing to the critics. Okay, so in any case, the show now is a great success. There are some things I want to share with you about the musical. You know, in the same way that when everyone writes about the movie now, they write about the phenomena that it made so much money. But it's so much more than that. It is, you know, it is a sort of parable about all kinds of movie making. It makes fun of the mad scientist movies. It makes fun of, you know, science fiction movies. It makes fun of love stories. It's a wonderful kind of satire that functions on so many levels. And there are a lot of stock characters in the movie that we've seen 1,000 times, but they're wonderfully, cleverly developed in the movie. So when they go to make the musical, one of the things that these men that came together to create this musical, who really had no experience in the musical theater, one of the things they did was to satirize all of the Broadway musicals. And it's very clever how they have done that in this show. Let me start with the entrance of the DeLorean. We know that the star in a musical always makes the big entrance. Usually it's about 20 minutes into the show. You know, when we watch Hello, Dolly, you can look at your watch and you know, oh, we're in 20 minutes, here's Carol Channing, and the show begins. Same thing happens with the DeLorean. We meet all the characters at the beginning. We meet the young boy. We meet his family. We meet the mad scientist. We have wonderful character songs that help us figure out that we're in 1985. And suddenly then, the DeLorean appears, and it's a stunning entrance. And Doc, of course, is driving the car. He's just invented his time machine. And so he has a wonderful song that's called It Works. And it's a very energizing number. And Doc is, you know, a bit of a lunatic, and he sings it in a very manic way, and the audience loves the number. But all of a sudden in the number, all these chorus girls come out and start dancing. And the young boy says to the scientist, "Who are they?" And he says, "I don't know, but every time I sing, they appear." And you know, it's a moment right out of a 1930s musical. I mean, suddenly, you know, people are sitting in the drawing room and someone says, "I hear music." And then suddenly 100 tap dancers come into the scene. The absurdity, the non sequitur of that we loved in 1930s movies happens every time we see Doc. It's a device. Doc, in the opening of the second act, sings a wonderful song about the 21st century and what it's going to be like. And he tells us in the lyrics, there will be no illness in the 21st century. And there's a lot of parody everywhere. And then this huge chorus appears and sings. So Doc is always surrounded by the spectacle of 1930s musicals. And then, you know, the young boy, when he goes back in time, you know, we start in 1985, and then he gets in the time machine and ends up in 1955, in the same little town in California. But now he meets his parents, who are his age, who have not yet really met, and he has to make sure they meet, they fall in love, they kiss at the prom, so he can be born. So it's a delightful story to watch. But watch some of the music in that period, in the 50s. There is a moment where young Marty gets hit by, it gets very complicated, you'll see in the story, but a tree branch falls on his head and he's unconscious, and a family takes him in 1955, and it's his mother's family, and he's ended up in his mother's bed, and they've undressed him, and the young girl is there, his mother, who's very enamored of him and thinks he's a cutie pie. And so she decides, because she's sort of peeked at his underwear, that his name must be Calvin Klein because the name is on his underwear. And so, we have this wonderful comic scene where this boy wakes up to discover that he's in his mother's bed and she's interested in him. So, this is a complication, right? She then sings a wonderful comic song called Pretty Baby. And the curtains open in the bedroom, and there's a girl group singing doo-wop as background. So the whole musical is done in this style, and it's very clever and it's very funny. And I won't give away any of the stuff, but it's a great treat. And again, the spectacle that you see at the end with what they do with the DeLorean is really, really over the top. And so you're in for a great treat. So please enjoy your journey back to the future. Thank you.